As I was revisiting season 2 of Megas XLR while playing around with Duolingo, I ended up with the 2-part final episode that inspired me to take a deeper look on the season finale because there are some details that were left ambiguous, mostly because it's a case of an alternate reality. Therefore, a lot of the character motivations that might seem strange could be brushed off as just simple timeline differences. But given how they seem to share some resemblances, I thought it would be interesting to explore what could have led to some of the circumstances we were exposed to in this alternate timeline. Now, the first thing I'd like to point out, and this is actually a mistake I made when I was a kid and continue to believe up until recently, which is that as far as we are aware, this alternate reality hasn't been confirmed to take place in the future. Part of the reason why I used to believe this was because it took place years after the Glorf had been destroyed, and given the character changes both in terms of personality and their physical appearance, I always just assumed that Coop accidentally sent himself and Gorak to a timeline taking place years into the future. However, as far as what we were informed, all we know is that this is a separate timeline. While it might be a future setting, it's not something that has been made clear, and if anything, there are actually some details that might prove that this takes place in the present alongside the timeline we're familiar with. The reason why I believe this is because if this really were a case of partial time travel, it wouldn't have made much sense for them to return to the main timeline during the night when they had initially left it around the afternoon. There's also the fact that Coop managed to establish a communication with the alternate Jamie right before he damaged the portal device, even though both of them were in 2 separate dimensions. This to me implies that both timelines are flowing at the same rate and in turn sharing the same time stream. What's likely happening here is that in the alternate dimension, either Coop defeated the Glurf much earlier than usual, or the events of the pilot took place earlier than the main timeline. You might even be able to say that the string of events are ahead of the main dimension for reasons beyond our understanding, so in turn even making it possible for the characters to be several years older. Now, whether or not this means that the alternate timeline is an indication of what is to come in the future for the main timeline is a completely different topic that I'd rather not speculate. What we can at least agree on is that both are technically taking place in the present. Now, something else I want to bring up, and this might even be the most confusing thing about this whole storyline, which is that how exactly did Jamie gain access to the Glorf mechs? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious he just straight up retrieved the robots and the mothership from the Glorf, which is actually shown in the episode to have landed on Earth and used as the main base for the resistance group. My question then becomes, how did he get it? Like, we saw in one of the flashback scenes that Coop defeated the Glorf somewhere in space, so Jamie would have had to fly there somehow, which doesn't make much sense because the resistance wouldn't have had a way to fly there in the first place. So how did he get it? I do have 3 theories that might explain this. The first one is that Jamie, if we're to assume he's the leader of the resistance, he might have convinced NASA and even other international organizations to send him to space in order to gather Glorf technology that would be used to combat Coop's tyranny. At that point, all he needed was to return to Earth with the spaceship, and afterwards they established a new base. This might have even happened while Coop was in another planet or something, and once he returned, he was welcomed with a new organization to fight against. Of course, this theory doesn't really hold much weight if we're to assume that Coop destroyed all of NASA's tech, so yeah, that would be completely discounted. My second theory is that maybe it wasn't Jamie that retrieved the Glorf's resources, but instead it was Coop. This may have even been one of the first few steps he took in his quest for tyranny, possibly even being the first line of mech henchmen before he eventually moved on to the white model troops, inevitably abandoning the Glorf technology after he saw no use to it, which is exactly what he did to the original Megas. The third theory I have is that maybe the ship landed on Earth at some point, although it highly depends on where the fight took place, which wasn't made very clear from the shot we saw. Another thing you might question is where and how did Coop collect the new mechs, including his own new robot model. However, this isn't really all that hard to imagine being true. He could have collected them on a different planet that had better technological resources than Earth, and it's even possible that they studied, replicated, and improved on the technology the Glorf had after they'd retrieved it. It is interesting though that Coop never destroyed the original Megas model or even the garage itself. Either he preserved it for sentimental reasons or as a backup in case of unfortunate predicaments. Speaking of Coop, let's talk about him in specific. So as we all know, he became evil and for no particularly blatant reason, such as tragic event that would turn him to the dark side, so it is certainly a bit of a head scratcher the fact that he flipped his ideals upside down. However, I think explaining Coop's direction in this alternate timeline might not be that hard. For one, I think it's important to note that Coop was never portrayed in the series as being heroic. He's always been a bit inconsiderate and self-absorbed, often focusing on his own desires and disregarding the consequences of his actions. Also, if you look at Evil Coop, he is presented as someone who both enjoys conquering and destroying civilizations, which can be seen in his immediate action to destroy Earth and the main timeline once he was given the opportunity to do so. These are actually traits that can be seen if you look at the entire series. The only difference is that they're presented in a much less extreme and maniacal manner. It comes off as simple power male fantasy being relished through him, but in the end, you can still see signs of megalomania if you observe Coop's past actions. The line that mainly separates both versions of Coop is their compliance to morality. This Coop embraces the evil inside of him, while our Coop generally still cares about being the good guy, even if he's extremely reckless. Jamie explains that Coop eventually lost his mind after repeated battles, which I interpret as him losing his moral compass and further boosting his ego and megalomania even further, especially as he grows older and comes to face and accept some of the more negative consequences of his actions, which might even make him more cynical towards the idea of wanting to maintain the image of a good guy. Evil Kiva, on the other hand, I'm not as certain as far as what to make of her. It's a lot more confusing because she's someone who's very serious and disciplined, used to be a military soldier fighting to save the species from an organization seeking world domination, yet somehow she became the very person she antagonized for years. If I had to extrapolate on what we know so far, I'd make the argument that perhaps the reason why she joined Coop in his tyranny wasn't so much because she thinks exactly the same way as Coop, but more so out of admiration for him. Now, Kiva's main motivation throughout the series was keeping an eye on Megas and trying to fix the time flux in order to send herself and Megas back to the future in the hopes of reuniting with the military and gather more assets in order to defeat the Glove for good. But after they were defeated, all she could do was stick with Coop and Jamie, which is actually what happened in the season 2 premiere when they first thought the Glove were defeated. Except here, she grew to respect Coop more, especially as his quest for power increased. If you observe her dialogue in this 2-part special, she tends to linger on how primitive her opposition's mechs are, which to me shows that she's obsessed with being as powerful and technologically advanced as possible. Now, I wouldn't equate this Kiva with the main timeline's version of her, but one thing they do have in common is their prowess in engineering. I think the main difference is that Evil Kiva took this passion to a new level and was willing to abandon the goals and ideals she had when she was in the future. Maybe the fact that someone as unheroic and unmighty as Coop managed to defeat the organization that her military couldn't do for centuries made her grow numb to the concept of idealism. Hell, even in the main timeline, we can see Kiva becoming more desensitized to Coop's recklessness. You also have to consider the fact that Kiva doesn't have any family left, so this might ease up her decision to not return to the future. This is the most I can make out of both Kiva and Coop's evil direction in this alternate timeline, because other than that, the motivations are kept very ambiguous, so there isn't much you can say without being too speculative. The only thing left to extrapolate is, I suppose, Jamie, but I think his motivations are pretty easy to understand from just watching the episodes. Perhaps the only contentious aspect of his alternate character would be the fact that he isn't a coward anymore, but I think you can justify this by simply pointing out the fact that Coop was his best friend, and seeing him turn into a tyrant probably made him develop some sense of duty and responsibility to stop him, which in turn made him overcome his cowardness. I guess there's also the fact that he dated Kiva at one point, but honestly, I don't think that's an interesting enough topic to cover, although it is worth noting that this could have also contributed to his desire to join the resistance against them, because now he has two people he cared deeply for that became evil and threatened humanity. Aside from that, I think I've covered the things I mainly wanted to talk about with this episode. Stay tuned for future videos, and I'd like to announce that I'm not doing the 2 weeks challenge anymore. Don't get me wrong, I am still studying Japanese pretty regularly and working on fiction writing, but I decided to manage my stories at my own pace. Right now, I'm focusing on one story, which is the one I published last time, and I'm thinking of ways to develop it even further without worrying about deadlines, which can even conflict with other stuff going on in my life like college. I also just got bored of editing videos that just simply announce that I wrote something, and I would rather work on videos that are topic centered and not just made to promote something. But other than that, I think that's it. See you next time.